I think that exposing a family or exposing a community or exposing a county to this kind of violence is going to create real injury. There is no justification for burning someone alive, hanging someone, brutalizing someone in this way. And I do think there is a kind of scarring that takes place. And that's why I really continue to believe that none of us is free in this country. We're all burdened by our history of racial inequality. It's created a kind of smog that we all breathe in, and it has prevented us from being healthy. And when we put out a report on lynching in 2015, we got hundreds of letters and emails and calls from African Americans whose family members had been lynched, and they desperately wanted to talk about it. And we sort of expected that. It was much more than we expected. What we didn't expect were the hundreds of calls and letters we got from white Southerners who talked about family members who would brag about having been involved in a lynching. White Southerners who remembered being taken as children to the sites of this brutality and how it's haunted them. And we are all haunted by this history. We've just practiced silence so long. No one has been willing to speak. And as long as we protect, for me, what's analogous is something like child abuse and sex abuse. For decades, children in this country who were sexually abused were encouraged to not talk about it. And they had to bear the trauma and the grief and the burden of that abuse by themselves. And it often left them vulnerable to doing things that were destructive themselves. And what we've learned about abuse and how to help people recover is that we've got to create safe spaces for people to talk about it so that people can hear you did nothing wrong. You're not responsible for that. I look at domestic violence. 50 years ago, we didn't deal with domestic violence very thoughtfully. If a woman complained about being abused by her husband, there was no likelihood in many communities that that man was going to be arrested. We just didn't think it was a big deal. Our attitude was, well, if you chose to get into a relationship with someone who abuses you, shame on you. That's your fault. And police would show up. We wouldn't make these arrests. But then we started listening to the voices of abused women, and our consciousness changed. And today, even our star athletes, if they are accused of domestic violence, they're going to face consequences that they would not have faced 10 years ago. And this consciousness raising, this narrative shifting is key to an increased shamefulness, awareness about child abuse and sex abuse and domestic violence. And we haven't done that when it comes to the history of racial inequality. In fact, we've done the opposite. We've actually created a false narrative about how wonderful and glorious this stuff was.
Right. Talking about the white people you've heard from who, are haunted by these things. One of the things I just want to put out there is that in addition to people posing for pictures, they sent postcards.
Yes.
And you talked about earlier about how, the bodies would be cut up. People would save pieces of the victims as mementos.
Yes.
So this was macabre, brutal.
Absolutely. Well, Black people were thought of as game. I mean, that commodification of African Americans that takes place during slavery. You're not human. You're something else. The slave catalog that we have in our museum on display, the title of it is what shakes me. It says, Negroes, Mules, Carts, Feed. And there is this inability to see the humanity of people because of their color. And posing with these battered bodies was like posing with the big fish you caught, the game you slaughtered, and carving up part of that as a totem of your accomplishment, your achievement in taking the life of a Black person just speaks to this horrific bigotry, this horrific disease that has so infected our nation. And it's why I think it's necessary for there to be treatment. A lot of people have assumed that somehow this stuff is just going to evaporate, it'll go away. With enough Black achievement, all of these things will dissipate. It doesn't work that way. Like a Black president. Like a Black president, but it doesn't work that way. It's a disease, and we're not going to get healthy, we're not going to get well until we treat it. And you can't treat it by ignoring it. You can't treat it with silence. You got to talk about it. You got to confront it. You got to acknowledge it. And something transformational has to happen. But that won't happen while we pretend this wasn't a big deal. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I really believe that the true evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to justify it. We said that black people are not people. They're not fully human. They're not evolved. The United States Supreme Court accepted that we're 3/5 human. And this ideology of white supremacy that we created to justify slavery, slave owners didn't want to feel immoral. They didn't want to feel like they were doing something inhumane. So they said, no, these black people need to be slaves. We're helping them by enslaving them because they're not evolved. They're not moral. And that ideology of white supremacy for me was the true evil of American slavery. And if you read the 13th Amendment, which is passed in 1865, it talks about ending involuntary servitude and ending forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery ends in 1865. I think it evolves. And that's the thesis you see in our museum. Slavery evolves into this era of lynching and terrorism. It's the reason why nobody cares that thousands of black people are being hanged and drowned and beaten and burned to death on the courthouse lawn while thousands cheer. Is because we have this ideology of white supremacy. We have this narrative of racial difference that victimization doesn't matter. And then it evolves into this period of Jim Crow and segregation. I mean, how could we have possibly believed it was sensible to say, you can't love that person because of the color of their skin? You can't play baseball with that person. You can't go to a social event with that person. You can't go to church with that person. We have statutes on our museum wall that talk about how even prisons were racially segregated. Even white felons and criminals had to be protected from the scourge of integration. And that consciousness can only be explained when you understand this continuing, persisting narrative of racial difference.
The honesty of both the museum and the memorial harkened me back to the first time I visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and just how powerful it was to be told history unvarnished and truthfully. None of the gauzy, euphemistic language. Here's what happened, here's who did it, and here's what we can do to not have it happen again. When I went to Berlin and I went to the memorial there just beyond the Brandenburg Gate, and the name of the memorial is like the National Museum for the
Murdered Jews
of Europe. I mean, they hit you in the face. You cannot get around it. And that's, to me, that was so powerful, to be told history truthfully and honestly, and even brutally in order to get you to understand. And so in seeing both the museum and the memorial, I think that's what sort of hit me, is that there's no sugarcoating here.
No.
If you come here, you are, whether you want to or not, are going to be confronted, and you will learn.
Yes, that's right. And I'm inspired by what they've done in Germany. I mean, you can't go 100 meters in Berlin without seeing markers or stones or monuments placed next to the homes of Jewish families. And what inspires me about that is that in Germany, people don't want to be thought of as Nazis and fascists for the rest of their lives, for generation after generation. They're trying to change the narrative. And because they talk about the Holocaust, because it's a country where you don't see Adolf Hitler statues, where there is no effort to glorify and romanticize that effort, his era, I'm comfortable going there. In Rwanda, it's the same thing. The Genocide Museum in Rwanda, they have human skulls in there. And for a lot of people, they say, that's just crazy. But people so desperately want to express their grief, they feel the need to do that. And I think that it's a pathway to recovery. When we say we did something wrong, when we own up to our history of violence and abuse and tyranny and enslavement, When we do that, then the opportunity for redemption is born. That's how you get to recovery. That's how you get to restoration. That's how you get to reconciliation. It begins with telling the truth. In most faith traditions, you can't just show up and say, I've never done anything wrong, but I want salvation. You have to acknowledge this need, because it doesn't resonate, it doesn't stick, it doesn't land. And in this country, we have developed a really bad habit of never saying, I'm sorry. And it leaves us incomplete as human beings, incomplete as a nation. Because apology isn't just something you're forced to do when you've made a mistake. Apology is how you grow strong, how you become more human. You show me two people who've been in love for 50 years, I'll show you two people who've learned how to apologize to one another when they hurt each other, when they've done something that didn't land the right way. That's how you build something stronger. And we haven't built a very strong relationship, a very healthy relationship to our history of racial inequality. And because of that, we continue to perpetuate racial inequality. And so I hope these museums become models for what other communities do to look more honestly at our past.